Australia is the most suburban country on earth. Around 75% of us call the suburbs home. So what's a suburb? There are many definitions, but it can be thought of primarily as a residential area, separate to the central core of the city and built largely for that purpose. Our suburbs in Australia are mostly very low density, but that's not necessarily the case in other countries. Our suburbs, except for those closer in, are very car dependent, which has given them some important characteristics. In this video, we've used a drone to take us on a flight over Springfield, one of the biggest new residential estates in Australia. Springfield Lakes, the residential area we can see, is pretty typical of most new suburban developments in Australia. Suburbs such as this offer the most affordable housing options for people who want to access a wider metropolis or city and still want to live in a detached house rather than an apartment. This desire to live in a detached house, known as the Australian dream, is still very strong. Research has shown that most Australians are not inclined to live in apartments, particularly those who have children, although many recent migrants to Australia are quite happy to raise children in apartments because of the environment they came from previously. You can buy a small 3-bedroom house in Springfield Lakes for around $350,000, which is still a lot of money, but it's relatively cheap for a new house. There are, of course, bigger and more expensive houses in Springfield as well. This type of suburb on the edge of the city used to be primarily the territory of young first home buyers starting a family. But the populations of the outer suburbs are getting more diverse. This area is quite a bit more multicultural than the rest of the state, but the median age of Springfield Lakes is about 29 years old, almost 10 years younger than the rest of the country. You've probably noticed that the houses are very close together with little outside space. The reason for this is a combination of high house and land prices, a scarcity of land that can be developed for suburbs, and different profit models for the large corporations that build these new suburbs. People are also building bigger houses so that life, by necessity, is mostly lived inside. This has implications for things like exercise, tree cover, biodiversity, and all those activities such as drying laundry, planting food gardens, and other projects that used to happen in the backyard. New suburbs are built these days according to a particular spatial logic, which is a bit like a planning formula for the built environment. This spatial logic has slowly developed since the advent of the family car. Since the 1960s, when car ownership became almost universal in Australia, planners and developers started building suburbs on the assumption that everyone actually had a car. What this means is that there is now very little that is walkable about these places. Although things are starting to improve and you might be able to see walking paths and bike trails, most of the everyday functions for residents, such as school, shopping, sport, church, and other services, are designed on the assumption that people have a car. This car-based spatial logic has a significant effect on the way people are able to socialise with each other. People who live in these suburbs are no more or less inclined to forming communities than those in the inner city, but in the suburbs the opportunities for this are different. If you compare Springfield to our other video on West End, the first thing to think about is that West End was built before people had cars. People relied on walking or perhaps cycling and some basic public transport. Most people also worked locally. What this meant, and still means, is that there is a good mix of functions such as houses, shops, pubs, coffee shops, and other services like doctors within walking or cycling distance for most people. The streets also have a grid layout, making walking efficient. Because people walk, and many independent businesses are local and street-facing in places like West End, people regularly come into contact with other members of the neighbourhood, and a psychological sense of community can develop. You start to recognise people. In Springfield and other new suburbs, people are forced to do much more in their cars. Houses have double garages with internal access, so contact between adult neighbours and children on the street is far less than in an older suburb. If people go shopping, it's at the very large Orion shopping mall, which you should be able to see now. This shopping centre is designed to drive to, not to walk to, and its scale is such that seeing one of your neighbours, or even seeing the same shoppers or retail staff on a regular basis, would be very unusual. So people lose the opportunity to have what we call accidental encounters with others in their neighbourhood. People often have to commute long distances to work, and in most cases for families, both partners need to work to pay the mortgage, meaning the streets have quite a deserted look during the day. This is not to say that the people of Springfield don't have the opportunity for community, but it must be more of a deliberate effort, such as joining a sporting club or a reading group. There are also active Facebook sites in these new communities, Asamoah and West End, which help to connect residents, and primary schools also are a great generator of community for those with small children. But for those unwilling or unable to deliberately join things, such as people who work at home with no children, or recent migrants, or the elderly, then the spatial logic of the new suburb can make it a lonely place. So I hope you can see that although people have generally the same sort of impulses to form communities and interact with each other socially, the nature of the built environment, the way that our neighbourhoods and suburbs are built and planned, can have pretty profound impacts on our ability and our opportunities to interact with each other on a day-to-day basis.